Hello, everybody. Hello and welcome. Thanks very much for joining us today. This is the second part of our webinar series entitled Unprecedented. And this week we're going to be talking about how COVID-19 has changed the way that we stay entertained. We've been looking at the emerging social behaviours around how people are entertaining themselves, and we'll also be talking about which of these we think are going to persist for the future. So as I know all of you sort of tend to ask during these presentations, the deck that we're going to go through today will be available on our events page later today. So on our website, We Are Social, on our events page. We'll also be hosting a Q&A after this presentation. So we're going to talk for about 30, 40 minutes, and then there'll be a 15-minute Q&A at the end. So do ask your questions as we go along. There's a Q&A panel in the dashboard that you'll be able to see that you can bring up anything that you want to chat about afterwards. So let's just introduce who we are today. Myself, I'm Mobbie Nazir. I'm the Global Chief Strategy Officer here at We Are Social, and I'm going to be presenting today with Laura Oxford, who is our Global Head of Cultural Insights. Do you want to quickly say hi, Laura?
Hi. How's it going? Thanks for joining.
So this webinar series is part of our ongoing thought leadership program. We do a number of reports during the year, annual reports on ongoing topical reports, researching emerging trends in the industry. So you might be familiar with our Think Forward annual trends report. We also have our big digital data report called the Global Digital Report that we've been doing for many years, covers nearly 200 or more countries. And during COVID-19, we've also been doing a series called In Lockdown, and we produced a report called Do the Right Thing, sort of a few weeks into the lockdown, talking about how brands should respond to this crisis and what were our recommended sort of activities in social. So this series, Unprecedented, is really the next in that iteration. And just to mention that the research that we do, a lot of it is bespoke for our clients. You know, what we're sharing today, we're sharing publicly, but we also work very closely with our clients on their own specific brand issues and business challenges. We work with some of the most pioneering and innovative brands in the world. And all of the research that we do is very much geared to how brands and clients can really apply it in their marketing activity. So why did we call this series Unprecedented? Well, you can't have failed to notice that unprecedented as a term has been, highly popularized during this time. This chart is actually from our Global Digital Report showing usages of the term unprecedented and how significantly it's obviously grown during this time. But what we think is really interesting is that, unprecedented means something that we've never seen before. And yet some of these behaviours that have happened during this time aren't necessarily entirely new. And I think when you start to look at and pull apart, what's new about what we're seeing or what is maybe actually just building on existing behaviours and motivations, it starts to help us see which of these behaviours might actually be around for the longer term. So that's why we call the series Unprecedented. So it's in three parts. Last week we talked about how COVID-19 is changing the way we connect. If you go to our events page on our website, you can find the deck there. Today we're talking about how the crisis is changing the way we stay entertained. And then next week on the 6th of August, we'll be talking about how COVID-19 is changing the way we stay informed. So today is about how we are entertaining ourselves during this time. So we've seen a lot of changes, obviously, in this time, and we really need to sort of look at how those changes have manifested themselves around the world. So in terms of how we gathered our research and data, we tapped into all of our offices around the world. We have 15 offices globally, from Toronto, New York, all the way through to China. And we have a social spotting network that's established across all of our offices, which is individuals within each of these markets who are culturally connected, embedded in internet culture, and who are out there really analysing and reporting on the trends that they're seeing locally. And what we do is we gather all of those local trends and we start to see where we can see some patterns emerging. And that's where we started all of this research. But in order to validate the trends and to really filter, what we think are longer term from what are going to be the shorter term behaviours that we're seeing, we also talked to an expert panel. So we've been consulting with a media psychologist and brand consultant called Dr. Tanisha Singleton. She's consulted with us across this whole series. So she's brought really useful psychological input to all of this. We've also been consulting with different clients. So every different week that we've consulted with a different client and a different brand in an industry or category that's relevant to what we're talking about. So for this week, we've been speaking to Matteo Bellini, who is the integrated media manager at IKEA in Italy. And I think IKEA is really relevant for talking about how are people staying entertained during the pandemic, because obviously we're all at home. And IKEA is obviously about how do you make the most of your life at home. So as a brand, they've been doing some really interesting stuff in this space. And then additionally, we've been working with our heads of strategy across some of our key markets. So we've worked with Harvey in the UK, Werner in our Singapore office, and Bruno, who is head of strategy in our Italian office. So that's been the panel that's helped us filter these trends and to really identify what are the patterns that we're seeing. So yes, I think it goes without saying that COVID-19 has led to some major disruptions in how we spend our downtime and how we're keeping ourselves entertained. I think there's been three things mainly that we've seen. The first is obviously we're spending less time outside and more time online. And I guess what's different about the way we're doing it now from how we were doing it before is that we're always online. Prior to the pandemic, there were times of the day when you would see spikes in online activity, but now we are just, all the time, 24/7 connected. And I think that's changed how we are entertaining ourselves quite dramatically. The second thing is that, we're going through a pandemic. There's been a lot more anxiety, uncertainty, destabilization of our routines and our norms. A lot of fear that we're seeing out there in the world. And so people are turning a lot more to escapism and nostalgia in this time, things that make them feel comforted and things that are soothing. So, that's been a major disruption as well. And the last thing is that, as we have disrupted our routines and the things that we would normally do have been taken away from us, we've had to experiment with new ways of doing things. And this forced experimentation has been really interesting. It's got people doing things that they weren't doing before, especially in the entertainment space. We're in some ways we're kind of running out of content to consume. So people have been looking for new sources of content, creating content in new ways, experimenting with new platforms. And I think it's worth really digging into some of that to see, how much of those behaviours do we think we're going to see for the longer term. So, so those are three of the sort of broad major disruptions we've seen in how people are entertaining themselves. And, around this, a lot of new behaviours have emerged. But, we want to really look at, not just what's emerging, but what could be around for the longer term. So what we've done is we've created a framework that helps us interrogate these behaviours and to really start to map out where we think those are which are shorter term and those which might be around for a bit longer. So the framework is in two parts. First of all, it looks at behaviours. So we're mapping these trends on the axis of, is this an existing behaviour? Is this something that we've seen before the pandemic in some shape or form? Or is it actually truly a new behaviour that we haven't seen previously? And then the second axis is motivations. So behaviours are what people do, and then motivations are why they do it. So I think it's really interesting to look at, how have people's motivations changed during the pandemic, and how have people's reasons for doing things changed, and are there new reasons emerging? I think during this period, we've really sort of had to reassess what's important in life, and we've maybe noticed things that we maybe had taken for granted in the past that we don't want to take for granted in the future, and so new motivations are emerging. And this creates a really interesting framework for us to map these trends onto. And then in each of these quadrants, we can group the trends that we see around some similar themes. So things that we map into existing motivations and existing behaviors, these we see as amplifications. These are things we were already doing. We're doing them more now, but they're probably likely to go back to their same levels they were before after this, after lockdown eases and we start to come out of some of this period. And an example of this kind of behavior is home delivered groceries. So we're going to give you examples from the food industry for all of these categories, but online shopping is something that people were doing, well before this crisis hit. Yes, we've seen a massive spike in it, but this is really an amplification of an existing behavior rather than something brand new. The next type of category of behavior that we're seeing is substitutions. So, these are existing motivations, but we're doing them in different ways. So we're substituting an old behavior for a new one. So a good example of this is digital supper clubs. So getting together with people to eat food online. So we used to do this in restaurants. We can't do this anymore. So we've substituted that behavior with doing it virtually. And the next category of trends that we're seeing are adaptation. So these are existing behaviors, but they are coming from new motivations. So an example of that would be immunity boosting foods. So before the pandemic, we were already seeing a lot of interest around health foods and a massive uptick around interest in health foods in general. But during this time, because of the virus, we've seen an increase in people interested in immunity boosting foods. So that's an existing behavior, but it's a very specific new motivation. And then finally, we've got what we're calling deviations. So these are new responses to and new behaviors that we are seeing that are coming out through this crisis. An example of that would be restaurant meal kits. So restaurant meal kits allow you to try out restaurant meals at home for yourself. This is a new behavior. It wasn't something that people were doing before, and it's a new motivation as well because it's not just substituting something that they were doing, but it's actually adding to the experience in a new way. So that's why we call it a deviation. And we think that actually the most interesting developments are those that are going to be on the right-hand side of this axis, the adaptations and the deviations. These are things that speak to new motivations during the crisis. And I think, if something is a new motivation, it's something that's more likely to persist for the future because, it ties back into during this time, we've seen things in a new light and with new eyes. And we've reassessed what really matters and what are our values in life. So we're going to use this framework to look at all the behaviors that we've seen around entertainment during this crisis and really map them out. And so I'm going to hand over to Laura now to take us through that part of the presentation.
Cool. Thank you so much, Mobbie, for that introduction. Hopefully that was super useful for those of you that are new to this. And for those of you that are here from rejoining from last week, here are some new behaviours that we've kind of seen emerging around this entertainment space. As Mobbie said at the beginning, we'll be answering questions at the end, so feel free to just drop them into the comments and we'll get to those after these behaviours. So first out the gate, we've got comfort blankets. So this is about the fact that at a time of extreme anxiety, people are turning to media and entertainment for a sense of relief. So before COVID-19, binge watching and the ongoing popularity of sitcoms like Friends and The Office had kind of taught us that entertainment can be an amazing way to help us protect ourselves from the outside world and kind of cocoon ourselves away from everyday anxieties. But during this crisis, obviously between daily death tolls and a digitized civil rights movement, entertainment that makes us feel warm and safe and can really comfort us has taken on a whole new fresh purpose during this time. And we're seeing this play out in a ton of different ways. So I love this. So Talking Pictures TV is a family-run TV channel airing black and white movies from like as far back as the 40s and 50s, I think. And they're based out of a Hertfordshire garden in the UK. And they completely blew up during lockdown and have really kind of evolved their business at this time. Then in the US, John Krasinski's Some Good News gained over 71 million views in just the couple of months between March and May, and then he actually sold it to Viacom. And that kind of tallied with a kind of massive uptick in Google Trends around people seeking out positivity and good news. I'm really looking to kind of seek out some kind of goodness and wholesomeness in the digital space right now. Then in South Korea, we've had, there's a community of vloggers that had gained a global following during this time for soothing silent vlogs that just kind of document them doing everyday routines, things like cooking, like bustling around the house, very soft, almost like ASMR style content has really blown up. And then in that vein as well, HBO Max is actually collaborating with the app Calm to create a TV show based on Calm, where celebrities will read soothing 30-minute stories in a TV mini. So we're really seeing this play out in lots of different ways all over the world. And so we've mapped this as an amplification because, as Bernard says here, the desire to turn off was there before, but what we're turning off from now is much more serious than it's been before. And this is really interesting, especially because right now it's a necessary behaviour that exists in tandem with a desire to stay informed. As Tanisha says, there's this about comfort through distraction, but because of what's going on in the world right now, we have to live in the now to make sure we know what's going on. There are too many, life or death situations right now happening in the world for us to switch off entirely. So people are kind of double dutching between being present and being engaged. Trying to escape for their own self-care where they can. And it really is a balancing act. And so in this sense, what we're seeing is that comfort media is an antidote to some of the behaviours we'll see in next week's presentation around how we gather information. So what this means for brands, I think in the short term, and certainly before there's a vaccine, there's a huge opportunity for brands to offer people a moment of escape at a time when their feeds are filled with anxiety around the pandemic and around wider political unrest. There are a lot, depending on what your brand stands for and what your brand values are, not all brands have to be talking about what's going on in the world right now. And there's a huge opportunity to help people kind of disengage at appropriate times. And it's also about leaning into entertainment. There's a great opportunity here for brands to show off their more kind of whimsical and playful sides too. In the new normal, I think we'll see anxiety levels hopefully decrease. I certainly hope so, as people start to get used to living with the virus, and then, once there's a vaccine, even more so. That's not to say that the need for escape won't still exist. The struggles of the everyday will continue to see people look to entertainment as a means of escape. But it's just unlikely to be maintained at the scale that we're seeing, and that's why we've mapped this out as an amplification. And then next, we've got Living Live. This should be a familiar one for everyone. So this is about the fact that live streamed entertainment has gone mainstream. So previous to COVID-19, there was a lot of buzz around live platforms, Periscope, Twitch, prior to the crisis. But live digital content was largely reserved for the fringes of digital culture and wasn't really something that we'd seen play out on a mainstream basis. However, during the crisis, obviously, and especially at the peak of the first wave, creators and viewers alike have been confronted with a huge amount of spare time, which has really given them the opportunity to experiment with live digital content and kind of remove the inertia attached to it in the process. We've seen this play out in a ton of different ways. So Twitch has seen a huge spike in viewing across the board, but in particular what's interesting is that Just Chatting, which is a channel that's known for kind of transcending gaming and being more broad, saw a huge amount of viewing hours during this time. Like in April alone, it got 134 million hours streamed. And we're also seeing things like there's another channel called Woke where people stream live protests, which is also killing it right now. Then we've got BTS hosting a concert during lockdown, one of many, but it was one of the most successful. So it drew over 750,000 paying viewers each of whom paid $25 to attend. And I think afterwards it's been shared and viewed over 50 million times. Then we're seeing brands really tap into this in some super interesting ways as well. So GCN Race Pass is basically a subscription model which allows people to watch live cycling races from all over the world through its app. And even once this crisis starts to die down, they're looking at experimenting with how they can use live content to actually, like live digital content, to complement the live races as they're happening. So whether cycling fans are where the races are or not, they can still kind of access many different kind of facets of that experience and that event in real time. And then also we're seeing in the short term, this is really impacting product launches. So the Galaxy Unpacked 2020 is a live virtual event to launch the next Samsung Galaxy handset, which I think is actually happening next week out of our Singapore office. So we're really starting to see live be used to support product launches and things as well. And this is something we're seeing from Matteo talking from IKEA as well. So the IKEA Entertainment Social Hub has been going on in Italy. And as Matteo says, we've been broadcasting live content using people from IKEA. So employees from IKEA have been shooting live streams directly from their homes and developing a real bond with their followers as well. So ultimately, this content series for IKEA has been real people talking to real people about their needs from the comfort of their homes. And creating this kind of real intimacy between them, and it works because it wasn't about the brand anymore. And I think that's what's really key here. Live does give brands an opportunity to humanize their brands by using the people who actually work within them. So we've defined this as a deviation, but this is probably one of the most controversial behaviours that we'll talk about today in terms of our panel kind of figuring out where this goes. So as Werner says, we've been talking about live for a long time now, and the tools have been around for a while too. But for most people, this is a new behaviour to actually be engaging with on a regular basis. So like I said before, Periscope launched back in 2015. And as someone who works in marketing trends, I've been talking about live for what feels like forever. But the reality is that most people simply weren't engaging with it. So while it is still close to the x-axis, we've classified this as a new behaviour. Then there's the question of motivation. So Harvey says that this behaviour has flourished at a time when actual live events haven't been available. So it certainly started out by serving an existing motivation. So yeah, virtual concerts like the one that BTS held are serving existing motivations. But then at the same time, there are some aspects of live content which are tuning us into new content norms and potential motivations, especially when it comes to the intimacy that this kind of content can provide. So Tanisha says that there's potential to make this behaviour more sustainable by driving new motivations through the use of influential figures. So, for example, the opportunity to work out with someone famous in like an IG live from Adidas is definitely a new motivation to download or purchase a home workout, right? Because it's the going to the gym element and getting a live stream of a home workout instead. That's an existing motivation, but then doing it for the reason of working out with an athlete you admire might be a new motivation. So that's why we put it in the deviation space, because it really does feel like it's a shift in terms of how we engage with social and digital content and entertainment in general. So in terms of what this means for brands, in Q3 and Q4, the desire for live entertainment will be heightened purely because of the fact that large-scale live events are still off the cards for the foreseeable future. So during this time, there's a huge opportunity for brands to really use this type of content to be more authentic, to show more human sides of themselves, to show a less curated side of themselves. And it really, live content in particular, does also tie into the fact that as we've kind of been seeing for a long time, production has been something that we haven't had as much access to. So live really ties into that as a seamless way to make content easily online. But then after the crisis has passed, what we will hopefully see is more brands look to use digital content to complement live physical events, as I was saying with the cycling race example, by adding an additional layer of exclusive access via digital channels. In this sense, live content has a lot of staying power. And it's especially true, as I mentioned, when it comes to working with influencers and talents, because brands really have an opportunity across categories to kind of help people get closer to their heroes and have more intimate connections with real people. So that's why we placed it in a deviation as well. Next, we've got Thirsty Fandoms. So this is about the kind of cultural moments that fan communities so often rally around have taken on a whole new meaning during lockdown. So previous to COVID-19, fan communities have always rallied around shared cultural moments. Emotions like anticipation and surprise are often really central to their experience as well. But during lockdown, many of the moments these communities have been waiting for have been pushed back or cancelled altogether, whether that be, you know, IRL experiences or like even just releases of films or the second season of TV shows or album drops or whatever. So in light of this, surprise drops and early releases at this time have been treated like real lifelines for fan communities and have really heightened the experience of being a fan. And actually, there's a lot of commentary around fan communities in general right now around this idea that during lockdown, because we haven't been able to connect with like-minded strangers, fandom has taken on a whole new purpose because it's been one of the only ways that we can do this. And we've seen this playing out in a ton of different and really interesting ways. So one of the kind of biggest global moments has to be the early release of The Last Dance on Netflix. So fans actually campaigned for the early release of The Last Dance. When they finally did drop it, I think ESPN Sport tweeted with loads of different examples of everyone who had been hassling them asking for it to be released early, basically saying like all you had to do was ask, and then they pulled it back from initial June release to an April release, and it became one of the most watched ESPN documentaries of all time. I think the most watched, with 1.5 million people tweeting about that final episode. That's a great example of fans really rallying and kind of getting rewarded for that rallying. So Euphoria, HBO's show Euphoria, the second season was due to be released, I think during lockdown or certainly very soon this year. And then initially it was announced that the show would be pushed back and we wouldn't be getting a second season in the immediate future, something I'm certainly gutted about. But then instead they've redirected their excitement around the fact that the director of Euphoria and Zendaya, which is the show's lead, have made a film during lockdown called Malcolm and Marie. So Euphoria fans have been redirecting their excitement and their energy towards Malcolm and Marie instead. Then we've got writer and director Miranda July is a great example of how an influential figure in a community can really kind of rally her fans and kind of keep them engaged throughout lockdown. And throughout this kind of stressful period in a very real way. So actually throughout lockdown, Miranda July has been doing a ton of amazing stuff in terms of, I think she made a film via Instagram with her followers, kind of getting their input on the casting and the script, really kind of bringing them into her creative process and giving them something to participate in during this time. And actually yesterday she announced that for the launch of her next film, she's going to release the trailer early to her Instagram followers and then ask them to all screen it unanimously on IGTV at the same time. So even in doing that, she's inviting her followers and her fans into her creative process and actually having them be a part of how she releases her film, which says a lot about what we're seeing as the kind of shake-up in the film industry right now. Another great example of this on a very macro scale is also just how many direct streaming releases we've seen. Frozen 2, Trolls World Tour are both international successes and examples of even kind of massive global brands being able to kind of tap into this and kind of give their fans and their communities something to rally around and kind of like a kind of little lift at a time when a lot of life has felt quite flat. So we have mapped this out as an amplification because it feels like familiar fan behavior, right? Driven by familiar fan motivations, but it's just something which has been elevated during this time. So the anticipation of release dates is a familiar feeling, says Tanisha, but it's turned all the way up right now because our patience is so thin. We don't want to wait. Distractions and alternatives are limited in this climate. We don't have much else to look forward to. So during this time, fandom has been reframed as a form of social programming and connection. I think that's what's so important here. And in terms of what this means for brands, though, there are some really, really interesting takeaways, I think, regardless of whether you have a kind of existing fandom or not. So the physicality of fandom has been removed at this time. So there's a desire to kind of generate heightened emotions to replicate these feelings. There's an opportunity for brands to really help people feel connected and feel something at a time when they can't share IRL experiences. And this kind of ties into a broader opportunities for brands to, again, to provide kind of emotional lifts to audiences during a period which is rife with anxiety. But in the long term, I think we could see people's expectations of brands shift. If you look at Miranda July getting her followers to release her film on IGTV, or Disney doing that early release for Frozen, that could fundamentally change the way releases happen moving forwards. And if this does happen, random acts of kindness and serendipitous events will need to be baked into brand calendars rather than something that occurs on a more ad hoc basis. As a result of this, we could also see people grow more impatient with traditional media cycles as well. Next, we've got virtual selves. So this is about people spending more of their time online as avatars, whether that be Animal Crossing or Fortnite. So before COVID-19, avatars were pretty much exclusive to gamer communities. And they have started to become increasingly commonplace on the internet in recent years, whether, you look at things like the emojis or the investment that certain platforms are starting to make in avatars for in-platform usage. But during COVID-19, we've obviously been stripped of the luxury of venturing into the outside world. So avatars have been much more popular as people started to really use their virtual selves as a way to immerse themselves in shared digital experiences in more kind of real and tangible ways. And there have been loads of amazing examples of this. So you've got our Singapore office worked with Global Pride to host a Pride March in Animal Crossing, which is a great example of people kind of really starting to project their values in these spaces as well. We've seen people creating quarantine blogs in The Sims for Quarantine Challenge, which has been massive and talked a lot about on platforms like Reddit. For those of people who weren't satisfied with just watching the live stream of One World Together at Home, which was Lady Gaga's global live stream from when we were at the peak of the first wave, Roblox actually opened an in-game venue so that people could attend that with their avatars as well. And then meanwhile, so the avatar app Taobao Life in China has been blowing up during this time as well. And Valentine's Day saw a load of brands use the platform to connect couples during lockdown so they could dress their avatars for a date and then meet up in the virtual space. So we've placed this as a deviation because it certainly feels like a new behaviour and it has been driven by some existing motivations. So as Tanisha says, it's about conscious participation driven by the desire to experience things in immersive ways when we're deprived on a sensory level. So the reason that we've put it so close to that central axis is because it is partially driven by the need to kind of substitute the physical world, right? But then at the same time, it's driving a whole new set of motivations around how we want to spend our time online. As Bruno says, this behaviour tallies with heightened gaming penetration during lockdown, but as we see more people invest their time in these digital spaces, we're likely to see them grow attached to them and want to spend more time with them in a more regular sense. There are some new motivations generating here as well. And this really ties into what Berna said here, which I think is really important to remember. Digital spaces like online games are also social networks. They're places where people can spend time and where communities can really be fostered. So these spaces become much more credible when you reframe them in this way, for brands especially. Like, just because these platforms are gaming spaces, a lot of brands maybe don't feel like they make sense in the gaming space, but ultimately these are also social spaces, especially online games, of course. So in terms of what this means for brands, in the short term, any brand that facilitates offline self-expression obviously has a huge opportunity to enable people to do the same via their avatars. But there's also an opportunity for brands to create immersive digital experiences for people to attend with their avatars. So if you look at Travis Scott's Fortnite show or graduations held in Minecraft, anxiety about the outside world will see people continue to seek out moments like these. And coming back to what we were saying in the last behaviour around really enabling people to feel something, even the Travis Scott show in Fortnite, even just watching a stream of that, I get like goosebumps on my arms because they are just such incredible and well-designed experiences that really do make you feel genuine emotion when you can kind of roam around within those worlds as well. But in the new normal, I think we're going to continue to see this develop. Platforms like Facebook and Snapchat are already investing heavily in avatars to use in platform. And this is part of a shift away from anonymity online and towards this kind of continued, more fully formed version of digital citizenship that we've been seeing kind of evolve over recent years. And against that backdrop, the avatars take on a completely new meaning and new weight. But there's also an opportunity for brands to really humanize themselves in digital spaces. So, using avatars to put actual faces on customer service, or even anthropomorphizing yourselves in spaces like Animal Crossing or Roblox. Something that we're seeing with virtual influencers is actually now brands can go to a virtual influencer agency, say, this is the kind of audience we want to target, this is what our brand stands for, and then they will make a person version of your brand. And we could see a lot more of that come to the forefront as this happens. Okay, so we are on to our final trend, which is home playgrounds. So this is ultimately about people using digital channels to make the most of their downtime from home. So previous to COVID, we had started to see the cocooning trend really take shape in recent years. The rise of the joy of missing out, seeing more people, and this had really seen people spending more of their downtime at home in recent years, enabled by digital services. But then during COVID-19, obviously, downtime from home wasn't optional anymore. People had to be at home all of the time. And so as a result, they've been getting really creative with not just home entertainment, but also how they're spending their downtime in general. And even as economies reopen, the homebody economy continues to be bolstered by anxiety around leaving the house. So in the second week of July, 70% of people in a global survey still didn't feel comfortable going about their kind of day-to-day out of home leisure pursuits. And so this is something which is really continuing to impact the way we spend our downtime now. And this is kind of bolstered by what Matteo from IKEA has talked about, the impact that COVID has had on our perceptions of the home. He says COVID-19 has been a crucial moment for us to understand the importance of our homes. They're not only a shelter, but an environment within which we can enjoy our lives. And we've been seeing this play out in a ton of different ways. So people have been invested in bigger screens. So the beginning of lockdown in the UK saw a 39% rise in TV sales compared to the previous year. So anyone who was previously just streaming on their laptop or whatever has started to maybe think, okay, now's the time for me to really get an actual TV for this time. We've also seen people investing in at-home workouts as at-home exercise stores. So Lululemon bought fitness hardware startup Mirror, which you can see depicted here, which kind of similar to Peloton, kind of gives you a really immersive virtual workout experience. Obviously, the rise of TikTok has been massive during this time and has really been driven by people looking to entertain themselves from home. And challenges from the beginning of the first wave, like category as social distancing, which is a play on RuPaul's Drag Race, to seeing people really pour time into crafting really elaborate costumes in the name of kind of making entertaining content, and then as well spending a ton of time viewing it as well. And then we're also seeing brands kind of jump in on this as well. So Spotify has been advertising playlists that can change the mood of your space depending on what you need it for. So just really thinking about how you spend your downtime and the kind of many facets of that can be reflected in your at-home space. So we've mapped this as an adaptation because, as we mentioned before, cocooning is an existing behaviour. Spending time and investing in your home is something that we've seen previously, but there are new motivations kind of driving making the most of our home space, and these are really likely to persist. So, as Bruno says, people have always wanted to enjoy their homes, but we don't have a choice right now. The home is becoming much more multi-purpose, and during this time we've got uncomfortable. Again, to echo what Matteo is saying, we're redefining what home actually means to us in this time. And this feels like it is something that will kind of persist longer term. So in terms of what this means for brands, in the short term, this behaviour will continue to be relevant. And there are opportunities across industries for brands to really maximise the potential of leisure from home for all family members and really kind of help people make the most of their homes and enjoy the downtime that they're spending there. But then in the new normal, what we're likely to see is that for brands that do successfully help people enjoy their space during their time, there's an opportunity to become a mainstay in people's kind of everyday habits and routines and their general like day-to-day lives. Because ultimately, like, the home is where people are their most true selves, right? So this is about brands really understanding that the context of their products at home is changing on a fundamental level too. And this could also impact product development long after COVID-19 ends. So to recap, we've got comfort blankets, people wanting entertainment that provides comfort amid anxiety. We've got live streamed entertainment going mainstream. We've got fan communities and the experiences they're having around cultural moments being heightened. We've got people spending more of their time as avatars online. And then we've got people investing in digital channels to make the most of their downtime from home. And when you see all of these mapped out, you can see we've got a kind of pretty widespread across the chart. So let's look at what unites the three kind of newest and most promising developments that we're seeing in entertainment behaviour. So what we see here is immersive entertainment moving from the fringes into the mainstream. Previously, all of these behaviours were kind of largely reserved for the fringes of digital culture. So, you know, live streaming, moving beyond gaming, helping people to connect in real time across genres. You've got home playgrounds, seeing people kind of really investing in emerging tech to keep themselves entertained from home. Love this tweet here about investing in VR right at the beginning of lockdown. So a lot of these very niche technologies starting to making their way into the home as well. And then, yeah, virtual selves, seeing a breadth of people immerse themselves in virtual worlds for a range of new interest-led reasons. And this ultimately comes back down to what Mobbie was saying right at the beginning, which is that the restrictions of lockdown have led to a huge amount of experimentation. And while some behaviours will pass with the crisis, we're also overcoming the inertia attached to a lot of others, and it's driving innovation. And as a result, we're already seeing brands and platforms adapt to this changing landscape. So Fortnite has just launched party mode, in which weapons and buildings have no place, but virtual hangs and holographic visuals do. And that's all about just spending time and having fun in Fortnite rather than playing the actual game. We've got Facebook launching avatars off the back, obviously, of everything that has been happening with Bitmoji and Snapchat in recent years. I think we all know that when Facebook starts investing in these kind of slightly more fringe technologies, it usually means that it's about to move into the mainstream. And those avatars will be enabling people to actually be themselves in a more immersive way, both in Facebook and in Messenger. And then lastly, the success of TikTok really also hails in this new form of social entertainment, which in itself is very immersive because second screens are not an option. You know, when you're scrolling through TikTok, it's not like Instagram or Twitter when you can just, you know, watch some TV in the background, have a conversation. In TikTok, all of your attention needs to be in the app. And so in that way, we're also seeing social platforms move to a more immersive space as well. Cool. Any questions? Want to pass it back over to Mobbie? Are you there?
Great. So thanks for that, Law. Yes, we do have a couple of questions that have come in that we can go through. So I'll start off with one that's about the social spotting network. So the social spotting network sounds interesting. Is there a market that tends to be an outlier in trends or one that leads the way? You know, either for this study or for more generally. I think definitely there are certain markets that are more advanced in terms of their use of social and digital, or even just have completely different frameworks for it, like China, as the person who asked the question mentioned. It's really useful for us to have our offices in China because we get to see how, you know, behaviours are shifting there, and I think it does give us some sense of where things might go in the future for us. Although culturally, China is so different to us that sometimes you have to balance it a bit. It's not just about they're more advanced, but also they are very different culturally. So some of the things that they do sometimes feel like outliers from our other markets. And I think depending on industry and category, you know, different markets may tend to be outliers for different reasons. What do you think, Law?
Yeah, I agree. I think something that I found fascinating actually is that China's very different in terms of the platform it uses, yes, and certain kind of wider cultural values. But then at the same time, even when we were doing Think Forward last year, um, it was fascinating how when you kind of pull back to the really macro trends, so for example, looking at people like the social self-care trend we looked at, which is around people starting to kind of want to protect themselves from their screens and think about how they can have a better relationship with the internet and protect their mental health. Those kind of macro trends are happening across the board, and it's quite interesting to see how even markets that are very different often will have a lot of similarities when it comes to those big kind of very human relationships that we have with social media. And so because of that, you'll often see platform developments happen in similar ways. But then, so yeah, I think in terms of internet culture, certainly China and also Japan tend to have kind of slightly kind of surprising or interesting deviations from what you'll see in the mass. And then again, from a kind of looking at an internet granular perspective, in the same way that, you know, whole country, like, you know, swathes of countries learn English from American sitcoms like Friends or The Office, in the same sense, you will see that a lot of memes will often originate from things that have come from the US. And I think a lot of certainly granular digital culture tends to often kind of be born in the US and then proliferate out in more local iterations based on local cultural values. So yeah, that would be my thought on that.
Yeah, cool. Moving on to the next question, which is about sort of monetization models for creators. So the question is, have you seen a consistent growth in how we reward many of these entertainers? I think, you know, this came up while we were talking about the live trend, especially when they're independent or don't belong to an established media group. You know, thinking of things like direct payments to creators via Patreon. I mean, this is something we definitely talked about in our last Think Forward report, the shift towards influencers and creators directly monetizing their audiences. So I think, yes, in this space, people are getting more savvy. And if you do have a community that's highly engaged with you and, you know, is really keen to see content from you, and you know you have that, and, you know, at the same time, we've seen the, I suppose, the industry legislation around how influencers market to their communities has shifted. So they have to be transparent and say that, you know, content is paid for, or content is advertising. And sometimes they don't really, you know, that doesn't sit well with their community. So, you know, I think, yes, increasingly creators are looking for different ways of monetizing what they do. I mean, clearly they need to be paid for what they do. But, you know, sometimes they don't always want it to be as blunt as, you know, an advert. And so, yeah, a shift towards engaging with your communities and spaces where you can ask them to subscribe for your content and pay for that content ongoing. You know, it works if you really have an engaged community in the first place. But I guess for creators are still new and still looking to build up their audience base, it's slightly different. Any thoughts on that, Laura?
Yeah, I think something else that's interesting to note here is purely, you know, the demand for content has been at an all-time high during this time. People have had so much time on their hands. They're scrolling more. They want more content. At the same time, at the beginning of the crisis, and a lot of brands stopped spending. Right. I don't think it's any coincidence that the American Influencer Council has just launched as a union, basically, for influencers, and have started trying to put some regulations around how they are getting paid and how much people should be getting paid based on following or and, you know, like ensuring equality as a part of that as well. I think during this time we've seen creators making a lot of content and then realizing that their jobs are actually still incredibly unstable. And I think moving forward, there will certainly be a shift to a more kind of regulated way of making sure that brands and influencers have have a fair kind of working relationship.
Yeah. Moving on to the next question, which is actually about content formats. So is either short form content, e.g. feed-based, or long form content, e.g. streaming and podcast, winning out during lockdown? And will this affect a shift in the supply of one or the other? Well, I mean, as we spoke about, podcast consumption has definitely seen a massive spike during this time. And we've also seen spikes in, that's long form content, but we've also seen spikes in people downloading apps that serve them short form content like TikTok. So we are sort of seeing consumption and interest in both types of content at the moment. What are your thoughts, Laura, in terms of longer term prospects?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's one of those things where it's about need states, right? I think there are times, something that's great about TikTok is that you can pick it up and it is short form, but you can be on there for 15 seconds, or you can be on there for 15 minutes, or you could be on there for an hour and a half. And so depending on where you're at in your day and what the purpose is of you picking up your phone or starting to scroll, if it's because you're going for a run, or you're taking some time out, or you're just taking a quick break in between calls at work, I think that's going to drive what kind of content people are looking at. But then what we have seen, again, we spoke about it in our trend report last year, is we have seen an uptick in long form content in recent years. That has started to come through with people. That's why Instagram now does carousels. That's why Twitter now enables threads. And I think we will continue to see long form content thrive as social. We're also seeing Instagram become a place where people go for news increasingly. And as that goes ahead, short form content isn't enough to give you a well-rounded news story. So as people start to use platforms in different ways, we'll see the content formats reflect that. But that doesn't mean the death of short form or anything too dramatic. It just means that we're seeing a real diversification of the kind of content that we're going to see on social platforms in coming years. And I think, again, COVID has been a huge catalyst for long form content because people have had time to experiment with it.
Yeah, so I mean, the recommendation really is to make sure you have a mix of both. It's not one or the other, really. And the right type of content for the right need state at the time.
Yeah, depending on what your channels are, for sure.
Yeah. So a question around, I suppose, the style of content that's become popularized during this time and potentially fatigue around it. So the question is, we're getting pushback from clients on at-home and live content as they worry audiences are fatigued by this look. Do you think this is something to be concerned by, or something audiences have actually embraced? I mean, it's a good question, isn't it? I think we're all kind of a bit fatigued by the situation in general. I mean, I'm certainly fatigued by being at home all the time. So I wouldn't be surprised if audiences are getting fatigued by that look on their screens. I think initially it was quite comforting because, you could see you weren't in it alone. I mean, everybody was going through this at the same time. I certainly remember thinking when I saw, programs that I would normally watch, sort of switching to this sort of in-home format, it just made me feel more sort of like I'm part of something bigger. But I do think people are starting to get a little bit fatigued by it. But I have seen people doing some very creative things. So, obviously, in many markets, we're still restricted in terms of being able to get together and film content in the ways that we used to. I saw a YouTube series that was put together called Done Breeding, which was actually about, it's just a comedy series about, I think 4 or 5 women going through the menopause in Brighton. And, it's all filmed on phones. It was, actresses and their partners all creating the content, but it never actually mentioned COVID or talked about COVID in any way, shape or form. It was just a really amusing sort of funny kind of comedy program about a common experience that women go through. I thought that's a nice way of actually dealing with it. So I feel like, while we still have these restrictions, we need to find more creative ways of getting through it. And maybe it's not sort of about directly making about the situation that we're in, but finding other ways of telling stories with some of the restrictions that we have.
Yeah, I think as well, to build on that, it's going to be about, I don't know if people are getting, I think at the beginning, like you say, everyone wanted to watch live. Then everyone put out a live about everything. And then everyone was like, oh my God, like, I just don't even know where to look. And actually, one of the things that we saw in the research was there was one, someone started like a TV guide for Instagram Live so that you could find out what was on at what time and who was running it to try and organize it. And I think what we'll see now is purely people will become more discerning. If they've watched a couple of lives from people that genuinely added value to their day, they will go back. Like with this webinar, for example, there was a time at the beginning where people might have signed up for all three. Now some people might only sign up to the ones that they think are going to be relevant to them. If the first one wasn't enjoyed, maybe they won't come to the second one or whatever. You know, I think it's just about really making sure that this content adds value to people, and being not just putting live out for the sake of it, but be like, what does it mean? What is it for? How are we adding to people's day? How does this extend our brand? And really thinking about it that way. So I think it's more about making sure that you're not just putting out content for the sake of it, because people will just learn to scroll past you.
Yeah, so we're running out of time, but one final question. In your opinion, will people become more reliant on avatars, creating an anonymous persona, or will they rely more on their authentic lifestyles as seen in the rise of live streams? You know, obviously we've spoken about both.
I think we're going to see a shift. I think a lot of what's going on with avatars isn't about anonymity, it's about aspiration. Avatars are an incredible way to kind of visualize a perfect version of yourself or experiment with who you are. And I think certainly on platforms like Facebook or Snapchat, or even what we're seeing with memojis, people love memojis because they're like adorable, glossy versions of themselves. And I think the mainstream version of it will be, anonymity and online identity play is very much something that we see happening, especially among younger generations. I think if this does take off in mainstream among older audiences as well, it will likely be as a kind of themselves rather than a kind of anonymous version. I think the anonymous version will probably remain quite fringe.
Great. Well, thanks for that. We have run out of time, so I just want to say another thanks for everyone who joined, and thank you for all your questions today. As I said at the start, this presentation will be available on the events page on our website later today, so you can download it then. Do join us next week on the 6th for the final part of this webinar series, and we'll be going through how have behaviours around information and education been affected during COVID-19. So that's it from us today. Thank you once again. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye.